Hello, Avon family. It's great to be with you from wherever you're watching this. I hope it's an encouraging moment for you. It's been so encouraging for me to really dive deep into this topic for the last week. And the topic we're discussing is belonging. It's a part of our new covenant. It's something that I feel extremely passionate about, and I think it's worth discussing. If we want to be a sacred space for the community, we need to talk about belonging. And so let's get to it. I remember a few years ago, I was reading an old preaching manual that I'd received in Bible college. And this preaching manual suggested that every great sermon starts with a joke. So, are you ready for my joke? Are you ready? A teen, a monk, and an escaped convict walk into a bar. Actually, I don't think you're ready for that joke. Okay, let me change it up a little bit. Are you ready for this joke? Here's the actual one I'll share. The joke is, belonging is easy. Do you get it? Belonging is easy. I mean, on one hand, belonging is this natural desire, this basic human instinct that we all need. We all need to feel belonging and acceptance. We need self-worth, and a lot of that is a part of being in a community. But on the other hand, it can be so challenging to actually belong. It's so challenging. I mean, we all have these moments. I mean, think about it in your own life. Which is easier for you to remember? A moment where you actually felt accepted, or a moment where you felt alienated? Belonging isn't easy. I mean, this is where the joke comes into it. I mean, you'd think it would get easier if we all know what it's like to be alienated or unaccepted. You'd think we would make it easier, right? We would understand, we would have empathy, and we would make it more accessible so that all people could belong. But life's funny like that. I mean, there's this weird thing that happens that as soon as we are a part of a group, the blinders go up. We stop remembering all of the reasons why we felt alienated at one point. We stop recognizing ways that we might be alienating people because we're in. We belong. Right? I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with the hazing culture that's in football. When freshmen are joining the team, they have to go through hazing and ridicule and really like abuse, and it's accepted. The in-group gets to set the rules on, you have to do this so that you can belong. And I bet you every freshman just hates it. And they're saying, man, why do we have to do this? I wish I could just be accepted. But the irony is, as soon as they are a senior on that team, they perpetuate the status quo. They say, I had to go through it, now so do you. Right? The blinders go up. Rather than saying, I remember how this felt. This was really awful. I think we should make this easier for the people who are trying to join our group. They continue the status quo. The blinders go up because they're in. So let's talk about it. Okay, if we want to be a community that is welcoming and accepting, that offers belonging, if we want to be a sacred space for our community, then let's remove the blinders. And so to talk about this, I have 3 simple stories. One about a teen, one about a monk, and one about an escaped convict. Story number 1. A number of years ago, I was working with another youth group, and one day a new student showed up. Now, the great thing was this student had zero religious background or knowledge or information. Like, I'm pretty sure she had never stepped foot in a church before. Not for a wedding or a funeral, not on Christmas or Easter. She had no concept of religion or the church until now. And the really miraculous thing is that she continued attending for years I mean, until she graduated, she was attending. And although we didn't have this big kind of conversion moment for her where she converted to Christianity or she had this big altar call moment, honestly, I think the miraculous moment for us was she was committed. Right? Every single week she showed up to our group, except for one. It was I remember it was a really snowy February evening. Youth was starting and she didn't show up. And that's fine. I mean, it's 1 week and even more than that. But it was really uncommon for her. She was there all the time and all of a sudden she wasn't. But, we thought nothing of it. We continued on with our evening and yeah, we just thought nothing of it. I mean, with 20 minutes left, I'm in the middle of my lesson. And the door opens and there she is. She showed up, only it's a little different this time. I mean, it's clear looking at her that she'd been crying for probably hours. Something was really wrong. And so I quickly wrapped up my lesson. I sent the leaders and the youth to small groups. And I sat down and had one of the most profound conversations of my life. Maybe not for her, but for me. I mean, I didn't know it then, but this was a life-changing conversation. It's not a big one. It's just a few simple sentences with a lot of silence in between. Are you ready? She said, I just found out that my parents are getting a divorce. And I don't know why. But when I heard that news, I knew I needed to be here. I can't describe it, but there's just something different about this place. I don't know what it is, but this place just feels different. I don't know what it is, but this place just feels different. I mean, what this student is describing is sacred space. A sacred space filled with God's presence. And although she doesn't have the language to describe it, she could feel it. She could feel this sacred moment, this sacred space that was created through acceptance, belonging, and unconditional love from a community that cares about her. I mean, often when we think about sacred spaces, we think about really traditional pictures. We think of steeples and statues. We think of holy books and hidden monasteries. We think of reverence and rules. We think of traditional pictures. But I would like to argue that a sacred space is not created through a statue or a steeple. Sacred space is created through belonging and acceptance and unconditional love from a community. See, here's my argument. A true sacred space offers belonging and acceptance. And on the flip side, belonging and acceptance has the ability to transform a seemingly normal space into something greater, into something sacred. I mean, we've been meeting at Elgin all summer in an ordinary parking lot in an ordinary field. But through belonging and acceptance and unconditional love for all, we have the opportunity to transform an ordinary parking lot in an ordinary field into something sacred. And as a church, if we want to be sacred space for our community, for our neighbors, for our friends and family, for Stratford and Mitchell and Sebringville and St. Mary's and Shakespeare and all of these areas, I think we need to start by transforming ordinary spaces with belonging. Story number 2. There once was a monk with the worst monk name ever. His name was Saint Kevin. Sorry to the Kevins out there. Saint Kevin left his royal lineage to seek after God's direction in his life. God, what do you want my life to be about? And as the legend has it, St. Kevin would spend hours standing in an icy lake with his hands stretched out, praying in silence and stillness. The story continues where apparently St. Kevin had been standing for such a long period of time and had stood so still that a blackbird had landed into his hand and laid eggs. Now, as St. Kevin was standing in this icy lake, God spoke to him. God said, I know the direction for your life, and it's this. Kevin, stop standing in icy lakes. Stop it. Go back to the community because I love them and so should you. So St. Kevin got out of that icy lake. He built a monastery right beside a settlement called Glendalough, and it grew. Monks were coming, and this became a super deep location for spiritual practices. People would spend long parts of their life immersed in spiritual disciplines. They would be in silence and solitude. They would be chanting psalms. They would be praying and singing worship. They would be fasting for days at a time. I mean, this was an immensely spiritual location. But for St. Kevin, he understood that the Christian life is, yes, it's immersed in spiritual disciplines, but it's also immersed in offering the practical hospitality of Christ. See, contrary to popular opinion, I mean, most of us, when we think of monasteries, we think of remote locations, but for St. Kevin and other Celtic monks, monasteries were built either in major settlements or on major trade routes so that they could be doing that practical hospitality of Christ. I mean, for St. Kevin, this monastery, it was an emergency fire department. It was a hotel. It was a hostel. It was a library. It was a food bank. It was a home for artists. It was all of these great practical ways of showing hospitality. They were directly connected to their community. Now, one practice has always resonated with me since I started reading about St. Kevin, and it is this. St. Kevin prioritized spiritual disciplines. I mean, they would fast for days, and they would refuse to stop for any reason except for one. And I love this. One reason to stop fasting was if a guest entered the monastery looking for a warm place to sleep and a hot meal, all monks should immediately stop their fast so that they could offer hospitality for that guest. See, a sacred space is where all people belong, and all people belonging requires generosity. Generosity. I mean, St. Kevin understood that true belonging was created through being intentional and practicing hospitality. Okay? Spiritual practices, hospitality, intentionality in the middle. Both of them are intentional parts of our Christian life. And the thing that I love so much about this is St. Kevin understood that we all have desires, we all have needs, we all have wants, we all have priorities. But those should never trump hospitality of a new person. I like to think about it this way. I think St. Kevin would agree with this statement. I value my spiritual practices, but not as much as I value your presence in my life. See, for St. Kevin, generosity is actually changing our priorities for the sake of the newcomer. Changing our priorities. Our priorities are here, but a new person comes and that is drastically changed. Changing ourselves, changing our priorities, our theologies, our ideologies, our spiritual practices, our calendars, our schedules, how we use our resources so that we can offer hospitality for the newcomer. Because I think it's important to note, When a new person is forced to change themselves so that they can be accepted by a community, that's called conformity. That's called assimilation. That's called peer pressure. But when a community changes themselves, changes their schedule, their priorities, their theologies, their ideologies, when they change to welcome a new person, that is called generosity. If we want to be a community, if we want to be a sacred space that is generous and welcoming and accepting and belonging, we need to value the presence of that new person in our life more than our own priorities. We need to be generous. Story number 3. There once was an escaped convict living in the Middle East. Now, this person, they had recently murdered someone and they had fled into the wilderness for safety, but also for livelihood. They became a shepherd out there. And I'm pretty confident in this when I say that this person was not religious, had no intention in looking for God. And yet God felt that this person had a voice that needed to be shared. Now, this escaped convict, his name was Moses. Like the Moses, you know? Whether you grew up in church or not, I think we have pretty much all heard of Moses. Moses was this spiritual but not religious person who had murdered someone and fled into the wilderness, and God initiated a sacred space so that they could have a conversation. God initiated this sacred space for Moses to enter, and God, in all essence, said, this is a space where you can belong, where you can be accepted, where you will experience unconditional love regardless of your past, and where we can have a conversation. But here's the important part, Moses. This sacred space that I've initiated, this is not just for your benefit. Because this is the third thing I think we need to talk about if we want to remove the blinders. Sacred spaces, communities where people belong, it's not just created for the people who are in the group. It is created to benefit all people. A true sacred space is initiated by God so that all can benefit, and I mean all. Because here's the narrative that we see in the Bible, and I like to picture it as a conversation between God and Moses. I think as God is sitting on a mountaintop with Moses, Moses is having a literal mountaintop moment where he is feeling acceptance from his creator. And God would say, Moses, let's talk on this mountain. You're accepted. I want to hear your voice. I want you to hear mine. Let's talk. But soon enough, I want you to invite your family. It's going to get a bit bigger. And eventually, I'm going to free all of the oppressed Hebrews in Egypt, and I want you to invite them to this mountain. And soon enough, we're going to welcome eunuchs and foreigners to this mountain, and eventually, Gentiles are going to be invited, and eventually, I'm going to send my son, and he is going to say these words. Jesus says, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Creator neither on this mountain or in Jerusalem, because all are invited, all are welcome, all belong, all are accepted by the Creator. We are sitting here today because Moses first sat with God. Are you following me? Moses started the conversation, but the conversation wasn't just for him. Moses initiated that conversation so that we could be a part of it. We are sitting here today because of the conversation that Moses and God had together all those years ago. And now we have the opportunity to be that metaphorical Moses. We are having a conversation with God so that other people can benefit, so that other people can be welcomed into this community. See, it's okay to have an in-group. I'm not saying it's bad that we're a part of community. What I'm saying is that God takes an in-group as the initiators of conversation. We start the conversation so that more people and more voices can be welcomed. Sacred spaces are for all. right? 3 stories. A teen who felt a sacred moment with God because she felt belonging and acceptance and unconditional love. A monk who understood that our priorities, our ideologies, our theologies, our schedules should never be more important than the presence of a new person in our lives, in our community. And an escaped convict named Moses who had a conversation with God so that we could be sitting here today, so that we can have a conversation with God, so that other people can be sitting here tomorrow. You belong here. And they can belong here if we remove the blinders from our eyes, if we can remove the barriers, if we can welcome them in wholeheartedly with unconditional love, because you were welcomed, because you were welcome too. Let's be a sacred community where people can experience belonging together. Amen.